All right, so we are starting with Unit 5. I'm on page 56 of the Big Ideas packet if anybody's following along, but I know I go pretty fast. So you might not actually be following along. Let me make this bigger. There we go. All right, so agricultural production regions. So farming is usually, or agriculture is done either commercially or through subsistence. I think you'll know that pretty well. Commercial, growing for profit, and mostly in the MDCs, more developed countries, subsistence in the LDCs for family consumption. Intensive versus extensive. Make sure you know the difference between those two. Intensive, it's high yielding. It's a high level of input, mainly in human labor. Like you have to hand pick stuff. You're using a lot of fertilizers and pesticides. Requires a lot of machines. So a lot of the fruits and vegetables, because those generally have to be done quickly before they perish. Extensive agriculture, there's less output and fewer inputs. So things like ranching fit there because you just put the animals out there. I mean, you do still have to feed them, but a lot of them will graze and it's not as much of an investment. Intensive commercial agriculture includes monocropping, where they just grow one or two crops. Much of that is what's done in the U.S. Plantation agriculture, which is done in the less developed countries and in the tropical regions. Market gardening, fruits and veggies and flowers. And then mixed crop livestock. Remember, mixed crop means that they're growing the crops and feeding them to the livestock. Intensive subsistence, wet rice farming is an example of that, where they have to farm with and leveling and food rice paddies. So they got to dig it out where the water could grow with it. Extensive commercial, our example was ranching. Extensive subsistence, things like shifting cultivation, which used to be called slash and burn farming. Nomadic herding and transhumance, which is where you have to migrate seasonally with the animals. Let's see, bid rent theory is tied in here. The land value and how it's used. If the land value is high, they buy less of the farmland and they use it intensively. If the land value is low, it's farther from the market and they buy more of it and they use it extensively, usually for animal grazing. Land that's closer to the central business district tends to be more expensive because it's more desirable. All right, some more spatial organization. I don't think we really talked about this. 90% of farms are small and family-owned, operated, but are being replaced by large-scale commercial agricultural enterprises. So horizontal integration is within a company's branches. So, for example, Walt Disney and Pixar Animation Studios collaborating to produce movies. Vertical is where you own everything in the entire commodity chain, from where the crop is grown and the land to when it's harvested and processed, all the way to the packaging and the commercial marketing for it. That's a vertical commodity chain. So commodity chains, the information network and people involved in one type or subject. So here's one here that shows it for, it doesn't show a specific product, but the input all the way to the consumers. What is the cause of the decline of small family farms? As large businesses switch from horizontal to vertical integration, large and more complex commodity chains form. Basically, it's expensive. Economies of scale make the cost per unit cheaper for corporate farms, pricing smaller farmers out of the market. As technology advancements grow, the carrying capacity of the earth increases, that they're basically more efficient, they can grow more. Economies of scale, I already said that. Large agricultural equipment is so expensive that it is cost prohibitive for small family farmers to purchase. So most small family farmers, they'll rent that equipment, and often for short amounts of time. They'll use it 24 hours straight. There's a farmer who lives across the street from me, and I can tell when he's rented his tractor because it's 3 a.m. and he's out there working on his field because it's so expensive. So they use it as much as they can. All right, the von Thunen model applies to land use in relation to agriculture and the location of the market. So von Thunen explains patterns of agricultural land use. The transportation costs to the market influences a farmer's agricultural decision to keep costs low. Up here, the model explains to rural land use by emphasizing the importance of transportation costs associated with distance from the market. And then specialty farming doesn't always conform, though, to fit the rings. So the core area here in the middle is the market. The first ring is intensive farming and dairying. So things like milk and berries, foods that are perishable very quickly. Remember, this model came out before refrigerated trucks, so things that perished had to be raised and grown close to the market to keep costs low. The second ring are forests. So the green on here is forest. That's timber and firewood. They don't go bad, but they're heavy and bulky and expensive to transport over long distances. And then the third ring are the extensive field crops. They're less perishable, so they can be farther from the market. They don't need as frequent transportation. And then the fourth ring are ranching and livestock. So they can be the farthest out. That goes along with bid rent theory, that if you're buying large lots of land, you want it to be cheaper. So that land is from farther out. And then beyond that is just wilderness. Limitations, regions of specialty farming. So some areas like Florida mainly has extensive field crops, and they specialize in fruit, and that has more to do with their climate. According to the model, California would mainly have forest agriculture, but California actually is a region specializing in fresh produce, and that again has to do with their climate and their land. There can be multiple market centers. Now we have refrigeration technology, so perishability is less of an issue. Different climates and soil types also affect the model, and government policies that encourage you to grow different crops can affect it. All right, the global system of agriculture, the commodity chain is the link that connects the steps of the production and distribution of a good. So a global commodity chain is the idea that you might plant and harvest crops one place, then you turn the ingredients into products somewhere else, and then the packaging, the shipping, and the selling, that they happen all different parts of the world. Countries are commodity dependent when commodities make up 60% or more of their exports. So sub-Saharan Africa is the most commodity dependent region. Let's see, agribusiness, anything that's involved in the production and marketing of a farm product. These businesses are able to take advantage of economies of scale. Remember, economies of scale is the idea that the bigger or the more you produce, the cheaper it is to produce it, because you already have the equipment, you already have the workers, so you can produce things better on a larger scale. That's why, like, when you buy stuff on Amazon, sometimes if you buy more of it, it's cheaper per item than if you just bought like one or two. Monoculture, the growth of a single crop in a field, but that can lead to loss of biodiversity. GMOs, genetically modified organisms that have had their DNA altered through genetic engineering, mainly used to create higher yields and build resistance to pesticides and fertilizers. Remember, that started coming about with the Green Revolution. Some different consequences of agricultural practices. Land changing due to interactions between agriculture and the environment. So we know that slash and burn leads to deforestation and air pollution. The loss of rainforests can lead to losing biodiversity, so less types of animals out there. Terraces, so using hilly terrain where steps are carved to create irrigation, can cause soil salinization. That's where the soil becomes too salty over time. Terraces on Vietnamese mountains where runoff is collected at the bottom. Chemicals get in that water, so they try to use the water at the bottom, but often the water is polluted with too many chemicals from fertilizers and other things they use to grow the crops. Draining wetlands, so water is pumped out of wetlands for the use of agriculture. Thus, the Netherlands did that. That can lead to desertification and habitat loss. Desertification is when good land that's arable starts to turn into desert land. South Florida's wetlands have been drained to create arable farmland that decreases habitat, causing less biodiversity. Shifting cultivation, again, that's basically the same thing as slash and burn. You only work on the land for a couple of months before moving to new places, and that leads to deforestation and biodiversity. Pastoral nomadism is when the animals and their shepherds migrate with food sources. The environmental consequences just leave less resources overall, that they deplete the grass and everything where they're eating. That's not as bad as some of the others, though. Social impacts, the economic purpose. Core countries are doing less agriculture as they urbanize, so they have less of the consequences of it. Periphery countries, remember those are the poorest, have more environmental consequences because they're producing food for themselves and for core countries. The USA gets imports from Saudi Arabia for natural resources like oil to support our urbanization. Changing diets, the demand for some foods like palm oil are changing. resulting in changes in land use. This causes overusing certain resources, like deforestation for palm oil. Women in agriculture, women make up more of the agricultural workforce, primarily in subsistence areas. If women were given more rights, land, machinery, and loans, they could improve productivity as they could put more focus on agriculture and the environment. So, for example, Ecuador provides programs that give resources to women to work in agriculture. Challenges of contemporary agriculture and innovations. Contemporary agriculture, remember, anytime you hear contemporary, that means modern. The modern advancements in agriculture are used today are GMOs, pesticides, and fertilizers. The gene revolution, that was where they were growing things like miracle rice and miracle wheat, was from 1980 to the present. That's using biotechnology. Let's see, GMOs, the long-term effects are not totally known, but they have learned that some things can cause cancer. They're carcinogens. Biotechnology improve the quality of the yield of crops and livestock via breeding and hybridization and genetic engineering, but that's led to pest-resistant plants, so they have to keep using more pesticides. Aquaculture is the farming of aquatic animals or cultivation of aquatic plants for food. So that's where they're intentionally raising fish for the market. Major environmental concerns are sustainability, meaning that if they keep doing these things for a long time, it's really bad for the environment. Soil and water pollution and overuse, extensive fertilizer and pesticide use, and loss of biodiversity due to monoculture and selective breeding. I was listening to NPR the other day when they were talking about the Great Salt Lake, which is in Utah, and how the Great Salt Lake has shrunk a whole bunch because so many of the water that feeds into the lake is used for irrigation and farming in areas like throughout Utah and the Southwest. So the lake itself is drying up. And they were talking about how all the birds that go from the north generally go through that area so they can feed and drink from the Great Salt Lake. And now they don't have it. So they've had a little bit of rain recently, and that's why they were talking about it on the news. So the lake has like recovered for like a year, but then it's about to go back to how things were. So basically what the farmers are doing is leading to the loss of the bird population. So it's an indirect effect. All right, let's see. The key challenge, how do we feed a global population that is growing? Lack of food access is still an issue with food insecurity and food deserts. Enough food is produced, but distribution is an issue. So there's a lot of food waste in places that are developed, and then there's just not enough food in places that are less developed. Let's see. Challenges of contemporary agriculture, the movements. So one big movement is the idea of sustainable agriculture, farming practices that carefully manage natural resources and protect environmental conditions to help future generations while maintaining farm profits. They consider the environment, the community, and getting fair prices in healthcare. The World Trade Organization, which is an extension of the United Nations, seeks to make trade freer through removal of tariffs and more things that distort the market. Domestic subsidies, there are market distortions that prevent free trade. So, for example, the U.S. government gives market subsidies to farmers. So it makes it really hard for people who are from outside the U.S. to compare or to compete with U.S. agriculture. Organic agriculture is a farming system that promotes sustainable and biodiverse ecosystems by using natural processes rather than synthetic inputs, which sounds nice, but there's bugs and they destroy crops. So you got to find some other ways that are not synthetic, natural, to try to kill off the bugs. The fastest growing sector of agriculture today is that organic sector. These products do not contain any GMOs, and the USDA determines if a product can have the organic sticker on the packaging. The Eat Local movement, Chipotle is one of the big promoters of that, is encouraging the utilization of local products, distribution, and production, which replaces national and international food systems. I feel like they'll talk about Eat Local on the test because it's a popular trend right now. But one of the big pros of why Eat Local is good for the environment is less transportation costs. So there are fewer big trucks that are shipping goods across the country, and that means they're not putting out carbon emissions. It boosts the local economy and you get fresher foods that were never frozen. The cons, that stuff can be more expensive. Local pollution due to livestock because the local meat has to be closer to the market and cows are stinky. Community-supported agriculture, a network of individuals who support one or more local farms with growers and consumers sharing the risk and the benefit of food production. So those are when they work together using like equipment, but also trying to get competitive prices. The cons, transportation barriers, increased food prep labor, and not all CSAs are profitable. And then urban agriculture, you have a question? Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry. I don't know what happened to it. Urban agriculture, a practice to help improve food security at the household level using vacant lots. This is a new trend too. Rooftops, balconies, or other spaces. In some urban areas, like in China, they're using old buildings where people don't live anymore and growing like vertical farms. Like they grow the farms in the empty buildings. All right, more challenges of feeding the world, weather-related hurdles. Developing countries lack preventative systems for some events like droughts, distribution problems. So in other parts of the world, food spoils before it arrives at the market or before it arrives, well, it gets from the farm to the market. So infrastructure problems are a problem with distribution. Developing countries lack necessary transportation systems to get the foods to market. A food desert, that's also a popular topic, but I think it was on the AP test last year, so I don't know if it'll be a big question this year. A geographic area where the access to affordable, healthy food options is limited due to the lack of access to supermarkets. So food deserts happen in urban areas and very isolated rural areas where they don't have grocery stores. They have places like Dollar General and Family Dollar where you can buy Takis and you can buy some frozen foods, but you can't buy fresh meat and fresh vegetables. And that's more nutritious. So those are called food deserts. Farms losing area due to urban growth. Expanding cities take agricultural land. Suburban sprawl takes over farmland near cities. This is definitely happening in the DFW area. In areas like Frisco and Prosper and Northern Plano, those are predominantly agricultural areas, and they are completely like subdivisions now. So the land prices closer to the cities in the center rise due to the higher demand, causing farmers to sell. Urbanization in and around Asian Africa will lead to decreased agricultural outputs of wheat and rice products. Let's see, it says 11% of the world population does not have enough food to eat. Economies of scale, again, I feel like this will show up again. Again, it's the idea of the reduced cost of producing food items as the quantity of production increases. So the larger the scale of production, the cheaper it is, and then better than smaller scale production. So a farm that's millions of acres is going to be way cheaper to produce stuff because they're using they already got everything going than somebody who's just going to have 100 acres. Let's see, government policies regarding food. Governments create subsidy programs to aid farmers in the core countries like the U.S. It's usually given to those large-scale farms that produce large amounts of cost-effective crops, encourages an overproduction, but discourages diversification of crops. So we get way too much of stuff, but not enough of other things we need. Developing countries, policies struggle to help production. Women in agriculture, basically, we know that the rights are not equal. And if things were better for women with education, it would be better for the economies of the countries where those women live. Let's see. Women do not have access to all of these things: fertilizer, tools, livestock, education and training, insurance, opportunities, land rights. I don't see it on there, but it should be. Oh, women are denied proper rights, resources, and infrastructure in some countries. Let's see. In the core, women are more recognized in agriculture. In the U.S., 36% of producers involved in daily decision-making were women, whereas in the periphery, women primarily are engaged in subsistence farming, and they work as unpaid laborers. Let's see. Origin and influences of cities. So this is moving into Unit 6 now. When we look at cities, let me zoom out a little bit because on there it doesn't all fit. There it goes. All right, so site and situation influence the origin, function, and growth of cities. Remember that site are the physical characteristics, like are there rivers, mountains, natural resources there. Situation is related to the surrounding features that are man-made. So they both influence the location and growth of cities. They influence political and economic priorities. Both are able to be changed by modern day technology. One can affect the other. Let's see. Gold abundance in South Africa results in mining. Gold mining is a profitable and a common economic practice. That's an example. Another example of situation, relations with neighboring countries, history, location of competing countries. San Francisco's situation is that it is a port next to the Pacific coast, next to California's agricultural lands. So remember, I never saw this one before. Memory tips, physical has an SI in it, like site, relation, like the relationship is situation. All right, effects of site on the function of cities. So it affects natural resources that they might use for drilling. If there's a river there, that could affect transportation and trade routes. So the conclusion, cities will develop and function based on the site they are built on as they utilize their natural resources. The effects of situation, it's good relation and control over the waterways. Good situation equals it's easier to take advantage of allies. Conclusion, cities grow faster and expand their influence through a better situation. All right. Origin and influence of cities, transportation, and communication. Urbanization, we know that's the concentration of people in urban areas. Government policies create incentives for urban growth. There's money, so governments want people to come to their cities. The pull factors, like cheap housing and fewer regulations on immigrants. Some areas there's cheaper housing, not like in the actual central business district, but in like low-income urban neighborhoods. Economic development, people are resources. As a nation develops, people come to the city for non-farming jobs. This was actually on, if any of you still do the, so this question, this should sound familiar. This was on the FRQ for Human Geo. Reasons why people come to the city. And when he did it, you have to be specific. Like they're coming there specifically for good jobs. They're not farming related. Or they're coming there for cheaper housing with fewer regulations on immigrants. So some of these you have to be specific. Infrastructure, services and infrastructure is better in urban areas like public transportation, roads, even like the internet. The internet's way better in big urban areas than even in Red Oak. Migration as a nation becomes more developed, fewer farming jobs are needed, so people move to the cities looking for factory jobs. There's rapid rural to urban migration, which causes a concentration of people in cities. Population growth, a high rate of population growth usually equals a very populated city. A high population causes economic development, but it also leads to slums and shanty towns where poor people can't escape the cycle of poverty. So there's an upside and a downside. So when countries are doing well, people move to the city. But if they move so quickly, the city can't keep up with infrastructure and they live in slums and shanty towns, usually which are in like the worst or unsafest parts of town, like in Rio, they have the favelas, which are on the hillsides, so they're prone to mudslides. They're also prone to disease because there's poor sanitation practices. All right, cities around the world in city land area. So some terms here, suburbanization, the establishment of residential communities on the outskirts of a city. They tend to attract young middle-class families looking for a more private lifestyle. In the U.S., many suburbs were created after World War II during a time period of immense population growth and industry. Urban sprawl, urban areas expanding in an unplanned and uncontrolled manner. So the city is growing so fast, it's just taking over everything in a not very well planned ways. Covers large expanses of land in housing, business, and roads. In 1980, many migrated to the western U.S., requiring cities to grow outward in order to account for the sudden population growth. Houston is a good example of urban sprawl. Like they have multiple downtown areas because they grew so fast and then they ran out of space. So they just started another downtown area and then that grew so fast. So like they have multiple central business districts. That would match the multiple nuclei model. So decentralization, that's the growth on the outskirts of an urban place or city, pulled residences, followed by businesses away from the central business district. This is starting to happen in the Dallas area, that a lot of businesses are starting to pop up outside of the central business district because the land is cheaper and it's just got into like crowded downtown. Decrease in density, made possible by a good highway system. This is also decentralization is what's happening in the technopoles. We talked about Silicon Valley in California, how it's become so expensive there that like the people they need to like teach schools and drive public transportation and run grocery stores can't afford to live there. So a lot of those companies are now moving out of Silicon Valley because it's just gotten so expensive. Exurbs are higher class suburbs. I don't think we use that word, that are separated from the city by farmland in between leapfrog development near the edge of a metropolitan area where the residents and community are closely connected to the main city and suburbs. So an exurb is a farther out suburb and it's higher end. That's probably like Prosper, Texas. Boomberg, that's a weird word, a suburb that has grown rapidly into a large and sprawling city, often made up of many planned communities that have begun to merge together, like Plano. An edge city, a place with more offices than beds, so more commercial centers and not as many homes. That's kind of like Las Colinas. We were just there. They had a lot more like businesses and economic stuff that weren't residential. Infill, I don't think we've had this word before, often used as a counter to urban sprawl. Infill is redevelopment that addresses vacant land parcels within previously built places. I've never heard that word before. All right, let's see, more on urbanization. The rate of urban growth, the annual percentage increase in urban population of a country measures how quickly or slowly a population is growing. Highest rates of urban growth are in the developing countries. Those countries have high TFRs, high rates of rural to urban migration. For example, India, China, and Nigeria, usually because they're getting industries in the cities. Level of urbanization, the percentage. So there's rate of urban growth and level of urbanization. Level is the percentage of people currently living in urban areas. Measures development. So the highest levels of urbanization are developed countries like the US and Canada. Megacities and metacities. That was on the mock exam because two different people thought there was a typo, that they were the same word. They're different. So a megacity is an urban area with a population more than 10 million. For example, New York City. A metacity has more than 20 million. There's only 9 of those, including Tokyo, Delhi, Mexico City, and Beijing. So meta is bigger than mega. Meta with a T is bigger. Causal factors, high birth rates, high urbanization. This is especially impactful in the peripheral countries. Let's see, issues with peripheral mega and metacities. They have high rates of unemployment and homelessness, crazy traffic and pollution, and they have a lot of squatter settlements. That leads to high crime rates and low quality of life. In mega cities, still really a lot of the same issues. People are still seeking employment, extreme congestion, severe flooding in some of those areas. Cities and globalization, world cities. We talked about these as being ones that have influence across the world, more than just economic, but it's usually tied to economic and political and cultural influence. It's not always the largest size in population. They are usually nodes or focal points of a worldwide network of economic, social, and informational flows. So New York, London, Paris, and Tokyo are all world cities. Let's see. They're centers of communications, financial industries, governmental organizations, entertainment, like Disney in New York City. I know there was Disney in New York City. Manufacturing and trade and transportation networks. And they're hearths of contemporary culture. All right, size and distribution of cities, the rank size rule versus primate cities. This is real recent, so hopefully this will start to sound familiar. Remember, rank size rule says the nth most populous city in a country will have 1 over n. So that means the second largest city will have half the population of the largest city. The 5th largest city will have 1/5 the population. So generally the U.S. follows the rank size rule, with New York being the largest and LA being almost half the size of that. And then Chicago being a third, Houston being a quarter. Primate city is when you just have one major populous city that's at least 2 times, or usually even more than that, as big as the next populous city. Mexico City is the best example of a primate city, with Mexico City at 12 million, and the next biggest cities all less than 2 million. Advantages of having a primate city: agglomeration. Agglomeration is the idea that businesses cluster together. So there's a lot of like good stuff in the city. But the disadvantage, you have unequal development, and it's like having all your eggs in one basket. If something bad happens in that city, it really affects the country. Advantages of rank size rule, there's more equal distribution, there's less brain drain, so it's not like all the smart, most educated and valuable people are in the core. They're distributed throughout the country. Disadvantages of following rank size rule, it's less efficient and more expensive, more difficult to attract global attention. A country will either have a primate city or follow rank size rule, or neither. They will not have a primate city and do rank size. All right, size and distribution of cities, the gravity model, and central place theory. Principles that are useful for explaining the distribution and size of cities. Central place theory, this was Christaller, and the one where there are hexagons, talks about higher order goods and having a larger threshold and range. Threshold is the number of people needed to keep a service. So, for example, to have a Chick-fil-A in a town, the population has to have a minimum threshold. Range is the distance people are willing to drive for a good or service. So, higher range, you're willing to drive farther for specialists. Lower range, you're going to drive a shorter distance, like for school or gas. The gravity model, which is based off of Isaac Newton and physics, that was on the Kahoot yesterday, is the degree to which two places are interconnected with each other. It's based on the size of the city and their proximity. So larger cities have more interaction. The larger a city, the greater the influence it will have on interactive cities. The connection between central place theory and gravity model, businesses located in places with larger thresholds promotes interaction from larger populations. More interactions with goods and services equals more profit, benefiting growth. I'm going to stop there because these are the rest, getting into all the other models, and I'm tired. Let's see.